writing Soon and Holy, I was thinking about the act of listening, and whether it's listening to music, whether it's listening to different languages, whether it's listening to, a kernel of truth within yourself, that I think of the book very much as about the act of listening and sort of tuning in to the way people cope with humor and with sort of camaraderie where I grew up and how different that is with the, cadence and of speech and the way people, seek humor where I live now in New York. It's just very, there's just different. I think I'm just the way I was thinking about translation and thinking about the cadence and tempo when I was translating from Spanish and from Portuguese. I think in my recent poems, I was trying to sort of capture the way people speak in sort of Northern Appalachian speech and to sort of listen to these voices of where I grew up in a way that I had sort of been listening to the poets I translated from Brazil. And so that was something that I think I didn't even realize I was doing while writing the poems, but it was really about deep acts of listening. I think I was just frantic to get out of there, and frantic to live elsewhere. And then I think it took decades before I was as interested in the way people speak and talk where I grew up as I was interested in. And I think that that's healthy. And I think that I would have been a lesser writer and a lesser person if I hadn't learned to listen and to read with great curiosity, and to translate fantastic writers from Spanish and Portuguese. And also 2 years ago, I co-translated a book by the Iranian writer, Garous Abdolmalikian, and I don't have a background in Persian literature, so I was just sort of helping with the alchemy of the poems once they were in English. But I think that I did, from with my co-translator Ahmad Nabdalizadeh, that I also got to do, that kind of deep listening of trying to understand the cadence and the tempo and the sonic pleasure of Persian literature as much as I could help recreate it in English with Garrous's poems. And so I think for me that it's definitely comes down to thinking about the shape of a sentence and what makes a writer's voice distinctive and what makes a poem speak for the place that it's about. And so I think it was thinking about how do I reflect these poems by Manuel de Barros about the swamplands of Brazil, and then eventually those are I was translating a poet writing about rural Brazil, and then I was like, oh, I think some of this, these deserted areas in Brazil also relate to some of the deserted streets where I grew up. And I didn't think of it at the time, but I think a number of the writers that I've translated who have sort of found a way to evoke place really deepened my ability to go back with some distance, emotional distance and linguistic distance, and sort of write this most recent novel, Take What You Need, and this new book of poems, Soon and Holy, about the place that I knew first and best. I'll do the opening poem since it refers to something you're talking about. Okay, so this is definitely a apartment poem about entertaining children on the 8th floor of a rental of 4 people and a dog in a 1-bathroom apartment. Still life with invisible canoe. Lavinas asked if we have the right to be, the way I ask my sons if they can be trees. The way the word tree makes them a little animal, dancing up and down like bears in movies. Bears, I have to say, pretend we're children. At a river, one of them says. So we sip it, pivot in the hallway, call it a canoe. It is noon and noon. We are rowing in a blue that is a feeling mostly. The way canoeing in the green under real trees is a feeling near holy. Take What You Need began with the character of Jean, of wanting to write about an artist whose work would go probably unnoticed under sort of the radar or sort of the known surface of American art. And I was, driving by the street where my brother lives in my hometown, where there's a number of unoccupied homes. And there's an artist that lives on my brother's street, and he does sort of creates these, he has several frogs, and he creates panoramas of these frogs riding like tiny motorcycles and sitting in bed or playing pool. They're just like sort of dioramas. Sorry, he makes dioramas with these amphibious creatures in his home. So, that's totally different than what Gene does and the character that I invented. But there's also a sculptor in my hometown who does work with upcycled art. His name is Norm Ed, and I profiled him for Orion magazine, and he was an influence. And then there was another artist in my town who became a dear friend, Helen Golovich, who went to flea markets, is probably the closest to Gene's spirit, who has just had this voracious desire to make art and to write poems and to do these gorgeous collages with cigar boxes that she stored in her basement. It just really wasn't about the pursuit of audience, which fascinated me. And so I just was, seeing that there was a way that these rural artists in my town had this relationship to art that really fascinated me and felt very different than what I was living in New York, where it's very audience audience is such a big part of the generative process, and it wasn't for them. I think that writing about art is, there's a great essay by Cesar Idra about this. Argentine writer Cesar Idra wrote a long essay about the relationship between visual art and the questions that drive visual art that sometimes can enliven writing when you sort of, there's a back and forth. I think there's a dialectic between contemporary writing and contemporary visual art. What makes them come alive, what stirs us to sit with them and want to return to them. And so why is this art? Why now? That like when you get out of your own sort of material, whether that material is language or whether the material is metal or whether the material is paint, sometimes it can free you up to think about these larger questions. And I think that's definitely been true for me. Soon and Holy, this new book of poems, has a poem about Ana Mendieta, and there's 2 collaborations with the artist Erica Baum, who works with, found texts and things like that. And in the novel, I think I went and learned to weld myself in order to have like a bodily sense of how to do it. So I worked with Julia Murray, who at the time was the only woman in the Welders Union of New York. And she was fixing bridges, but she was also making sculptures in her apartment. And so how she rigged up the fan system to get the argon gas, out of her apartment definitely shaped the way I wrote about Gene's improvised air circulation system. So I think and then I went to the Center for Metal Arts in my hometown. And then I worked with, it was like in a former steel mill. And so I worked with Norm Ed. And so I was working with a lot of different metal artists and observing their approach so that I could do a convincing, portrayal of how to make the art. So I would suggest that if an art form interests a writer, that in addition to admiring it, get off of YouTube, get off of reading about it, and make the art yourself. It doesn't matter how good the art is. It's just feeling it in your body.